The courtroom was unlike any other that morning. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows, cutting through the stale air of anxiety that clung to the room. Reporters lined the back benches, their pens and laptops ready, though even there, seasoned faces betrayed unease. Jurors sat upright, hands folded nervously in their laps, exchanging glances that spoke of the heavy responsibility pressing down on them. Family members of both the victim and the accused leaned forward, breath shallow, as if afraid to miss a single word. At the very center of all this weight sat a child barely 3 years old, her feet dangling several inches above the polished courtroom floor. She swung them slightly, more from habit than playfulness, her small fingers curled tightly around the edges of the wooden bench. She had no concept of what a trial meant. She didn't understand the words verdict, evidence, or testimony. To her, this was simply a strange, serious room filled with adults who stared too much. But to the lawyers, the judge, and the jury, she represented something far greater. Innocence untouched by corruption, a voice untainted by rehearsals or manipulation. A case had already drawn national attention. Headlines branded it, the trial. That hinged on a child. Television trucks sat parked outside, their satellite dishes aimed skyward. Inside, every eye was fixed on the toddler whose presence had shocked many. Critics argued it was unethical to bring someone so young into court. Supporters countered that sometimes truth came from the purest voices. Judge Raymond Pierce, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering adherence to procedure, found himself in uncharted waters. He had presided over murder cases, high-profile scandals, and corporate fraud trials. Yet never had he seen a 3-year-old seated before him as a potential key to justice. He shifted slightly in his high-backed chair, peering down at her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Across the room, the defense attorney, Martin Hayes, shuffled his papers with exaggerated annoyance. A veteran of criminal law, Hayes considered the presence of the child little more than a stunt. He had already prepared objections, each one designed to paint the prosecution as manipulative. A toddler cannot possibly offer credible testimony, he had hissed to his colleague earlier that morning. This is a circus act, nothing more. The prosecutor, Emily Grant, thought differently. A rising star with a reputation for uncovering hidden truths, Emily believed the child's role was pivotal, not because of what she might say, but because of what she might reveal. It wasn't about words. It was about instinct, connection, and a moment no jury could ignore. As the bailiff called the court to order, silence rippled across the room. The atmosphere thickened, every creak of the wooden benches echoing louder than it should. The child glanced up at the sound of the gavel striking. Her wide, innocent eyes blinked, but she made no sound. Reporters later wrote that the silence felt alive, a moment suspended between disbelief and expectation. The victim's mother sat 2 rows behind the prosecutor, clutching a tissue in both hands. Her eyes were red from weeks of grief, but today they held something else: hope. She believed the little girl knew more than anyone realized, though not in words adults could easily interpret. The night of the tragedy, the child had been there. She had seen, she had felt, and though her memory was fractured by her tender age, there remained a connection, a thread only one being could confirm. Judge Pierce cleared his throat, glancing first at the prosecution table, then at the defense. "This court," he began, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity, "acknowledges the unusual circumstances before us today. While the presence of such a young child raises questions, we proceed with the understanding that all parties will respect the seriousness of these proceedings." Hayes stood. "Your Honor, I must once again register my objection. This child cannot provide rational testimony. She is 3 years old. The jury is being manipulated by spectacle. Emily rose calmly, her tone measured yet piercing. "With respect, Your Honor, we are not asking this child to provide traditional testimony. We are asking for a simple demonstration, an observation that may illuminate the truth. The defense would have this jury believe the truth must always be buried under technicalities. But sometimes, truth is simple. Sometimes it comes from where we least expect." The judge studied both attorneys for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted again to the child. She had begun to play absently with the ribbon in her hair, her innocence a stark contrast to the gravity surrounding her. At last, Judge Pierce said, "Objection overruled. We will proceed carefully." The defense attorney slumped back into his chair, lips pressed thin. The little girl's father leaned down, whispering something soothing into her ear. She nodded softly, though her gaze drifted toward the double doors at the side of the courtroom. She had no idea what was about to happen, but she seemed to sense it was important. That was when the doors opened. A ripple of murmurs spread instantly through the crowd. Uniformed officers stepped aside, and padding confidently across the polished floor came Max, the police canine, whose role in the investigation had been crucial. The German shepherd's coat gleamed under the lights, his movements disciplined and steady. He was no ordinary dog. He was a decorated service animal trained in search, rescue, and detection. Yet his appearance in the courtroom was anything but ordinary. For the jurors, it was shocking. For the gallery, it was electrifying. For the defense, it was infuriating. But for the child, it was something else entirely. Her wide eyes locked on Max the moment he entered. She sat up straighter, her toy falling silently to the floor. Her tiny hands gripped the bench tighter, as though bracing herself. To her, this was not a stranger. Max's handler guided him forward, stopping at the center of the room. The dog sat obediently, gaze fixed on the girl. His ears perked, his nose twitched, and his tail made the slightest motion subtle, but enough to stir the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Gone was the stiff air of formality. In its place was a current of raw anticipation, as if everyone sensed that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The little girl tilted her head, studying Max with the kind of quiet focus only a child could possess. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply looked. And Max, breaking every expectation of discipline, let out the faintest whine, a sound filled with recognition. The gallery gasped. The judge's brow furrowed, leaning forward in curiosity. The court stenographer hesitated, hands frozen above. The keys. Even the skeptical jurors leaned closer, their eyes darting between the girl and the dog. For the first time that day, the child's lips parted. A whisper, barely audible, slipped out as she tugged on her mother's sleeve. Her mother bent down, listening closely, then nodded gently. The stage was set. A courtroom, filled with people accustomed to hard evidence, sworn statements, and exhibits, found itself caught in a moment where truth hovered just beyond reach carried. Not by facts, but by instinct, innocence, and an unspoken bond between a child and a dog. And though no one yet knew what would happen next, everyone could feel it. The trial was about to change forever. The silence that had gripped the courtroom in Part 1 was shattered by the creak of the heavy side doors. All eyes turned as a tall officer in uniform stepped forward, guiding by his side a German shepherd whose very presence demanded attention. Max, the decorated police canine, a name whispered in newspapers and evening broadcasts, had arrived. The dog had been pivotal during the investigation, trained to follow trails where human eyes failed. He had tracked evidence, uncovered hidden clues, and led investigators closer to the truth. But never before had he been summoned into a courtroom. Like this, not as an exhibit, not as a handler's tool, but as a witness of sorts. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Some reporters instinctively reached for their cameras, though the bailiff snapped sternly, "No photography." Still, the pens scribbled furiously. This was history in the making. A police dog walking into a courtroom not for ceremony, but for testimony in the most unconventional sense. Jurors exchanged uncertain looks. Was this even allowed? Could an animal play such a role? Their instructions had been to weigh evidence, not emotion. Yet already, the sight of Max's symbol of loyalty and integrity was stirring something in them. The defense attorney, Martin Hayes, slammed his palm against the table, his face red with fury. Objection. He barked before the dog had even reached the center of the room. This is outrageous. What possible relevance can a dog have in a trial of this magnitude? But the judge raised a single hand. "You'll have your turn, counselor. Sit down." Hayes fumed but obeyed, muttering curses under his breath. Max's handler, Officer Daniels, gave a short tug on the leash, and the dog sat obediently at attention. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His brown eyes scanned the room, alert but calm, until they found her, the little girl. Her reaction was immediate and unlike anything the court expected. Her entire body stilled, her dangling feet froze, and her small hands went slack against the bench. Her toy doll slipped quietly onto the floor, forgotten. Her gaze locked with Max's, and in that instant, the room seemed to fall away. To her, it wasn't about courtrooms or trials. It wasn't about juries or verdicts. To her, it was recognition. The girl's lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Her chest rose in tiny, quick breaths, her eyes glistening with the beginnings of tears. She leaned forward, as though pulled toward the German shepherd by something, invisible yet undeniable. Max tilted his head, his ears perking. Then, in a move that stunned even his handler, the canine let out a soft, plaintive whine. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Officer Daniels blinked, his composure shaken. Max was a dog of discipline, trained to resist distraction in the harshest environments. He did not whine. He did not break stance. Yet here he was, betraying instinct, in front of an entire courtroom. Judge Pierce, curious, leaned forward. His gavel remained untouched. He didn't want to silence the reaction. He wanted to understand it. "Proceed," he ordered quietly, though his voice carried over the whispers. Emily Grant, the prosecutor, rose from her seat. She had anticipated resistance, had prepared arguments and evidence to defend the dog's presence. But even she hadn't expected this. The child's reaction, the dog's recognition, it was beyond strategy. It was raw truth spilling into the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Emily said, her voice firm, "you are witnessing something that cannot be scripted. Max, this police canine, has been involved since the earliest days of this case. He tracked evidence, he alerted officers, and he did what human eyes could not. Today, you are seeing him respond, not to me, not to his handler, not to training, but to her." She gestured gently toward the little girl. The defense attorney shot up again. "Objection. Speculation. This prosecutor is trying to manipulate emotions with theatrics. A dog wagging his tail is not evidence." But before the judge could respond, something happened that silenced even Hayes. The girl, still staring at Max, let out the faintest giggle, a sound innocent, pure, and unexpected. She raised her tiny hand, as if she wanted to reach out, though the dog was several feet away. Max's tail thumped once against the floor. The courtroom froze. It wasn't much. To an outsider, it might have seemed trivial, a dog wagging, a child smiling, but to those present, it was monumental. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a rehearsal. This was recognition born from experience. The judge, intrigued, turned to Emily. "Explain." Emily nodded, stepping closer to the jury box. "Your Honor, Members of the jury, on the night of the incident, this child was present. She was too young to articulate what happened. But Max was there too. He was deployed at the scene. He found her. He comforted her. And today, months later, he remembers her. She remembers him. That recognition is not theatrics. It is truth, unfiltered and undeniable. A collective shiver seemed to pass through the jury. The defense scrambled. Hayes stood again, his voice cracking with desperation. Dogs are animals, Your Honor. They respond to cues, to sense, to training. What the jury is seeing is coincidence at best, manipulation at worst. But Hayes's argument faltered the longer Max remained fixed on the girl, eyes locked, tail tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. The jurors saw it, felt it, and no counter-argument could erase the authenticity before them. The judge let silence linger. Then, leaning back in his chair, he said, "The objection is noted." Overruled. Continue. Emily turned to the little girl, her voice soft, careful. "Sweetheart, do you recognize this dog?" The girl blinked, hesitating. Her lips quivered, her tiny voice too faint to hear. She leaned against her mother, whispering into her ear. The mother's eyes widened, tears brimming, before she nodded encouragingly. The child lifted her chin, her gaze never leaving Max. She didn't speak yet, but the courtroom knew the moment was approaching. The gallery leaned forward, reporters frozen mid-sentence, jurors bracing as though instinctively aware that something profound hovered in the air. Even Judge Pierce, known for his unshakable demeanor, tapped a finger lightly against his bench, waiting. The bailiff, a man who had spent years watching countless trials unfold, whispered under his breath, "Something's about to happen." And it was. The child shifted on her bench, her little hands gripping the railing, preparing herself in the only way a toddler could. Max's ears twitched, his body leaning ever so slightly toward her. The connection between them tightened, invisible but undeniable, pulling everyone into its orbit. No one breathed. The defense attorney clenched his jaw, sensing control slipping through his fingers. Emily clasped her hands behind her back, willing herself not to interfere. Officer Daniels, standing beside Max, swallowed hard. In that fragile silence, anticipation grew unbearable. The question was no longer whether the child would speak, it was what she would say. And in that single breathless moment, the fate of the trial seemed to hang on the lips of a 3-year-old girl. The hush that fell over the courtroom after Max's entrance wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that vibrated, charged with anticipation, as if every molecule of air was waiting for what might happen next. The little girl sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the German shepherd, sitting so still in the center of the room. Her legs dangled motionlessly now, her earlier nervous swinging gone. To her, the strange adults, the judge in his robe, even the clicking pens of the reporters, all of it disappeared. The only thing that existed in her tiny world at that moment was Max. Her small lips trembled. She had seen him before. Not in this scary room, not under the hot ceiling lights, but on a night she could barely piece together in her memory. She couldn't describe it like adults did. She didn't have the words. But she knew. Children often carried truths adults had forgotten how to trust. Max tilted his head, studying her. His handler, Officer Daniels, shifted uncomfortably. He had worked with Max for years and knew the dog's discipline was legendary. Yet here, in front of this little girl, Max was different. His gaze wasn't professional, it was personal. A faint whimper slipped from Max's throat again, low but audible enough to make the gallery stir. Murmurs echoed. "Did you hear that?" He knows her. The judge rapped his gavel lightly, but even he didn't demand silence. His eyes were locked on the girl. Something rare was unfolding before him, something no legal textbook had ever prepared him for. Emily Grant, the prosecutor, recognized it too. She had gambled when she brought Max in, believing the child's instinct would cut deeper than any cross-examination. And now, she was watching her gamble pay off in ways she hadn't dared to hope. But Hayes, the defense attorney, was growing desperate. He stood, voice raised in feigned authority, though his tone carried unease. "Your Honor, I object again. This is not evidence, this is theater. A toddler staring at a dog is not testimony. The jury is being misled." The judge didn't immediately respond. He watched Max's tail thump softly against the floor once, then twice, as though answering Hayes without words. Finally, the judge said, "Objection noted. Overruled." His voice was sharp, final. Hayes sank back into his chair, defeated. For now, the little girl shifted slightly, her tiny fingers curling into the wooden railing before her. Her mother leaned down, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. You can say it. Don't be afraid." The child glanced up at her mother, then back at Max. Her eyes brimmed with something only a few in the room recognized recognition that came not from logic, but from memory embedded deep in the heart. "Do you know him?" Emily asked gently, her tone stripped of any courtroom formality. She spoke as if she were asking a friend's daughter a simple question at a park. The girl's lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, she gave the smallest nod. A ripple surged through the room. Jurors shifted in their seats, leaning closer. The victim's mother buried her face in her tissue, sobbing softly. Even hardened. Reporters felt the sting of tears as they wrote feverishly. Knowing this was no ordinary moment, they were recording history. Max responded instantly to that nod. His ears perked, his body leaned slightly forward, and then, astonishingly, he lowered himself into a bowing posture, a gesture handlers knew as submission, trust, and recognition. It wasn't a trick he had been asked to perform. It was his choice. Officer Daniels gasped under his breath. "I've never seen him do that unsolicited." The jury noticed. The judge noticed. And most importantly, the little girl noticed. She smiled faintly, the first genuine expression she had shown since entering the intimidating courtroom. For a child who had been silent, closed off, and frightened, that smile spoke volumes. Hayes scrambled again. "Your Honor, I cannot sit by while this courtroom is swayed by animal behavior. Dogs can be trained to perform. This proves nothing." Judge Pierce's gaze snapped toward him, ice cold. "Then let the jury decide what it proves, counselor. Sit down." Emily stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the girl. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "do you want to tell us something about Max?" The girl fidgeted. She kicked her dangling feet lightly, her small hands gripping the bench tighter. The pressure of dozens of eyes staring at her was too much. So instead of answering directly, she turned again to her mother, whispering. The mother bent low, listening carefully, her face crumpling as tears welled in her eyes. She whispered, "Back, you can say it louder, sweetheart. Everyone needs to hear." The child hesitated, but Max gave another soft whine, wagging his tail more firmly this time, as if encouraging her. The room seemed to shrink in on itself. The jury leaned. In, breaths caught. The gallery stilled. Even Hayes, for all his bluster, couldn't hide the nervous twitch in his jaw. And then, with a small burst of courage, the girl sat up straighter. Her tiny voice wavered, but carried across the room, filling the silence with a sound that pierced. Straight through the hearts of everyone present. She pointed directly at Max. The gallery held its breath. 2 words, just 2, were about to fall from her lips. But before she spoke them, the entire courtroom could already feel the truth. Rising like a tide. Judge Raymond Pierce had seen almost everything in his decades, on the bench violent offenders glaring at juries, grieving families collapsing in tears, lawyers shouting themselves hoarse, He was not a man easily shaken. Yet, as he watched the small child and the police dog locked in silent communication, he felt something stir in him he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity laced with awe. He leaned forward, his robe rustling as he rested his elbows on the desk. His sharp eyes scanned the little girl's face, then shifted to Max, the decorated canine. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a connection. The courtroom was frozen in anticipation. Jurors leaned forward. The gallery barely dared to breathe. Even the stenographer, usually mechanical in her duty, had her fingers hovering mid-air above the keys, afraid that typing might break the spell. The little girl shifted nervously on her seat. Her cheeks were pink, her lips trembling. She wanted to say something, but didn't know how. At 3 years old, her vocabulary was tiny, her understanding limited. Yet the truth she carried inside was vast bigger than the adults around her could yet comprehend. Her mother brushed a hand across the child's back, whispering encouragement. "It's all right, sweetheart. You can say it. Don't be afraid. Just tell them what you told me." The girl's wide eyes darted around the room. Dozens of faces were watching her, some kind, some skeptical, some blank with expectation. She shrank into her seat for a moment, gripping the bench rail tightly. Then her gaze returned to Max, and Max, as if sensing her hesitation, shifted forward an inch, his ears perked high, tail swishing softly across the polished floor. The judge's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "This dog is doing more work than any lawyer in here," he thought. Emily Grant, the prosecutor, took a cautious step closer to the bench. Her voice softened into something that sounded less like cross-examination and more like friendship. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "we all know this is scary, but you don't have to be afraid. We're just listening. That's all. Can you tell us about Max? Do you remember him?" The girl's chest rose and fell quickly. She whispered something into her mother's ear again. Her mother looked at the judge, her eyes wet with tears. "She says she knows him. She remembers him from that night." Gasps rustled through the gallery. The jurors stiffened. Martin Hayes, the defense attorney, sprang to his feet, his face flushed. "Your Honor, I must object. This is pure hearsay. A 3-year-old's half-formed memories cannot." "Sit down, counselor." Judge Pierce cut him off sharply. His voice carried a weight that silenced Hayes instantly. The judge wasn't known for patience when it came to repeated objections, especially when he himself wanted to see what came next. Hayes gritted his teeth, sinking back into his chair. His frustration was palpable. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. The judge turned his attention back to the little girl. His normally stern tone softened, almost grandfatherly. "Young lady," he said slowly, "would you like to tell us yourself? You don't have to say a lot, just what you remember. We'll all listen carefully." The girl blinked at him, her small shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, it seemed she might retreat into silence again. But then Max gave another soft whine and wagged his tail more deliberately, as though urging her on. The girl's tiny voice finally broke through the silence, shaky but clear enough to echo across the room. "Good boy." 2 words. So simple, yet so powerful that the courtroom collectively gasped. The words carried no rehearsed polish, no lawyer's coaching. They carried only the innocence of a child who had seen something unforgettable. Max immediately stood, tail wagging furiously, his eyes bright and fixed on her. He barked once sharp, decisive, as though affirming what she had just said. The room erupted in emotion. Some spectators covered their mouths. The victim's mother sobbed openly. A juror wiped tears discreetly. Even Judge Pierce felt the impact in his chest. For years, he had ruled by evidence and precedent. But in that instant, he knew he had witnessed something no statute could measure. The child's 2 words weren't evidence in the legal sense, but they were truth in the purest sense. Emily's eyes glistened as she turned to face the jury. You see? No one told her to say that. No one rehearsed this. That is recognition. That is memory. That is truth. Hayes leapt up again, desperation cracking his voice. Dogs wag their tails for anyone. Children say nonsense all the time. This proves nothing. But his words sounded hollow now, drowned out by the undeniable authenticity of what had just occurred. Everyone in the courtroom had felt it, seen it, believed it. The bond between child and dog wasn't manufactured. It was real. Judge Pierce banged his gavel once, not to silence emotion, but to restore order. His gaze swept the courtroom, finally landing on Hayes. Counselor, I will remind you that the jury will decide what weight to give this moment. You will not dismiss it out of hand. Hayes swallowed hard, his face pale. The judge then turned. Back to the little girl. His expression softened once more. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice carrying both authority and gentleness. That was very brave. The child smiled faintly, relief washing over her. She leaned back into her mother's embrace, her small body relaxing for the first time all morning. Max, still wagging, settled back down at his handler's side, though his eyes remained on the girl, protective and loyal as ever. The moment lingered like a fragrance in the air, delicate but unforgettable. Everyone knew they had just witnessed a turning point. For Judge Pierce, it confirmed what he already suspected. This case was no longer about cold, hard facts alone. It was about something deeper, something that could not be ignored. And though he would never say it aloud in that moment, the judge knew the trial had just taken a path that would change everything. The hush that followed the child's tiny voice seemed almost holy. For a split second, the entire courtroom held its breath, as though the weight of those 2 words had frozen time itself. Good boy. 2 syllables spoken in innocence, but loaded with a power no attorney, no expert witness, no polished speech could ever hope to match. Max, the seasoned police canine, reacted instantly. His ears shot up, tail whipping against the floor with rapid, joyful thuds. He whined a high-pitched sound that betrayed an emotion police dogs weren't trained to show in court. Then, with surprising swiftness, he stood on all 4s and tugged against his handler's leash, trying to close the distance between himself and the little girl. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Jurors leaned forward, some covering their mouths. A woman in the back row let out an audible sob, unable to contain the swell of emotion that crashed over her. The handler held Max back gently, whispering commands, but even he looked shaken. Max's reaction wasn't one of random excitement. This wasn't the dog simply recognizing a kind tone or wagging for attention. This was something else. This was recognition, memory, bond. The little girl's lips curved into a fragile smile. Her tiny hand lifted, trembling, as though she wanted to reach for the dog. Good boy, she whispered again, this time softer, almost like she was remembering a moment that had once made her feel safe. The prosecutor, Emily Grant, swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she stepped closer to the jury box. Her voice was steady, but laced with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've just witnessed something no one in this courtroom could have scripted. That child recognized Max. She recognized the very dog who was there the night everything happened. The defense attorney, Martin Hayes, shot to his feet, his face crimson. Objection, Your Honor. Pure speculation. A toddler's vague words and a dog wagging his tail? This is theatrics, not testimony. Judge Pierce raised a hand, but did not immediately gavel him down. He studied Hayes for a moment, then turned to the jury. Members of the jury, You will decide how much weight, if any, to give what you have just seen. Counselors, proceed. His decision kept the moment alive. Hayes slammed his papers down on the desk and sat, muttering under his breath. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The jury had felt the weight of that moment, and Hayes knew he could never erase it. Max continued to fix his gaze on the child, his body quivering with excitement. The handler glanced nervously at the judge. Permission to let him approach, Your Honor? Just for a moment. He won't disrupt. Pierce hesitated. This wasn't standard courtroom procedure, not by a long shot. But then he looked at the little girl, at her trembling hand, at the unshakable way the jury leaned forward as though begging him to allow it. His decision came quickly. Permission granted, he said firmly. The handler loosened the leash. Max trotted forward eagerly, his nails clicking against the polished wood floor. The sound echoed like a heartbeat. When he reached the child, he stopped abruptly, lowering his massive head until his nose brushed her tiny knees. He wagged furiously, whining softly, nudging her hand with his snout. The girl giggled through her tears, the sound pure and untainted by the heaviness of the room. She patted his head clumsily. Good boy, she said again, louder this time, her voice filled with relief. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The courtroom erupted not in chaos, but in a wave of raw emotion. The victim's family clutched one another. The prosecutor wiped her cheek quickly, trying to maintain composure. Even a few jurors dabbed their eyes. The defense tried to protest again, but the moment was too powerful. His voice was drowned out by the silent, invisible verdict already forming in the hearts of the jury. For the judge, it was unlike anything he had ever presided over. He watched the bond between child and dog unfold like a scene out of some higher truth, a truth that no lawyer could manipulate, no rule of evidence could define. The girl's innocence, paired with the dog's unmistakable recognition, painted a picture more vivid than any testimony. The prosecutor seized the moment. This child isn't testifying with words alone. She's testifying through recognition, through trust. Max has no reason to lie, no ability to invent. His reaction is as real as it gets. Together, they've shown you something the defense can never explain away. The juror's eyes darted between the child, Max, and the defense table. Hayes sat rigid, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might crack a tooth. He tried one last attempt. Rising slowly, he forced a sneer. Ladies and gentlemen, children say all sorts of things. Dogs wag their tails for anyone who pets them. Are you going to send a man to prison because a toddler said good boy? But his words were met with silence. Cold, heavy silence. For the first time in the trial, the jury didn't seem to hear him. Their eyes didn't follow his hands or his pacing. Their attention was fixed firmly on the small child, and the German shepherd still pressing his head into her lap, as if he had finally found the one person in the room who truly understood him. The moment stretched on, each second carving itself into memory. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would headline papers and dominate broadcasts across the country. Finally, Judge Pierce banged his gavel. Softly, not to silence, but to steady the room. Let the record reflect, he said, his voice unusually heavy. The witness was allowed to approach the child. The child responded with recognition. The dog responded with recognition. The jury will determine the significance of this interaction. But everyone knew. They already knew. The girl leaned against her mother, exhaustion settling into her tiny frame. She had spoken her truth, though she barely understood it herself. And in doing so, she had shifted the entire weight of the case. Max returned reluctantly to his handler's side, but not before looking back once more, his tail wagging slowly, his loyalty shining through his dark, intelligent eyes. The judge adjourned for a recess, his gavel striking with finality. Yet the echoes that lingered weren't of wood against wood. They were of a toddler's voice, pure and unshakable, cutting through lies and legal jargon with two simple words. Good boy. And in that unthinkable reaction, the child's recognition, the dog's joy, the courtroom's tears, the trial had turned on its axis. The recess bell had barely echoed through the courtroom when the weight of what had just happened began to ripple outward. Reporters surged from their benches, whispering frantically into recorders, their pens scratching across notepads. Family members clung to one another. Even officers posted along the walls exchanged stunned glances. But the most powerful reaction wasn't happening among the adults. It was happening inside the heart of a 3-year-old girl. She clung tightly to her mother's hand as they stepped into the quiet hallway, her tiny shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. The tension that had filled her body inside the courtroom had melted, replaced by something softer, safer. For the first time since she had been asked to appear, she wasn't afraid. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice still, fragile but carrying a hint of joy. "He remembered me." Her mother's eyes flooded with tears. She crouched down and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, he remembered you. He never forgot." Behind them, Max padded calmly alongside his handler, his steady gait betraying nothing of the excitement he had shown just minutes earlier, but his eyes never left the child. Every few steps, he glanced over, ears perked, as if reassuring himself she was still there. The handler, hardened from years of service, shook his head in disbelief. "I've worked this dog for years," he muttered. "I've never seen him react to anyone like that." Inside the jury room, emotions were running high. 12 men and women sat around the long wooden table, their notes scattered before them, but no one seemed to be reading. Instead, they spoke in hushed voices, replaying the moment again and again. "Did you see the way his tail went crazy? That wasn't random." The way she said it, those weren't coached words. You could feel it. A skeptical juror leaned back, arms crossed, but his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, she's just a kid." But he trailed off, shaking his head, unable to find an explanation that didn't circle back to the undeniable truth. Meanwhile, defense attorney Martin Hayes sat alone in a cramped consultation room, his suit jacket tossed carelessly across a chair. He rubbed his temples, fighting the pounding headache that had plagued him since the child spoke. He had spent weeks constructing airtight arguments, carefully dismantling every piece of evidence the prosecution had presented. But in a matter of seconds, a toddler had undone it all. "This is absurd," he muttered to himself. "This isn't evidence. It can't be." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The jury had already been swayed, not by logic or facts, but by something far more powerful, emotion. And once jurors' hearts aligned with their convictions, reason rarely pulled them back. The prosecution, on the other hand, was alive with renewed energy. Emily Grant paced her office with her team gathered close. "We don't overplay this," she warned, though her voice shook with suppressed triumph. "We let the jury hold on to that moment. That bond spoke louder than anything we could say. Our job now is to guide them toward connecting that emotional truth with the hard evidence." Her assistant grinned. "Honestly, I don't think we'll need to push. They've already seen the truth with their own eyes." Back in the courthouse cafeteria, whispers circulated like wildfire. "Did you hear what happened?" one spectator murmured. The little girl recognized the police dog, called him a good boy. The dog went straight to her. "Are you serious?" Another replied, eyes wide. "That's going to break the case wide open." Even the reporters, who had covered countless trials, knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Cameras flashed as journalists rushed to file stories before the evening news cycle. Headlines were already forming. Toddler's words. Shake courtroom. Police dog and child create unforgettable moment, and innocence speaks louder than evidence. But for Judge Raymond Pierce, the impact was quieter, more personal. He sat alone in his chambers, staring at the oak-paneled walls. He had always prided himself on keeping emotion separate from judgment. Yet, as he replayed the girl's trembling voice and Max's unmistakable reaction, he felt the foundations of his detachment crack. He remembered his granddaughter, just a year older than the witness, and how her innocence often revealed truths adults overlooked. He thought about the bond between humans and animals, the trust that couldn't be faked. And for the first time in years, he questioned whether justice was always defined by statutes alone, or if sometimes truth revealed itself in the simplest, most unexplainable ways. When court resumed, the gallery filled faster than ever before. Word of the morning's events had spread across the city, drawing curious onlookers who squeezed into the back rows. The air was thick with anticipation. The bailiff called the court to order, but this time, the energy was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of earlier days. It was charged, alive, as though everyone in the room knew they were standing on the edge of a verdict that would be remembered for years. The little girl didn't take the stand again, but her presence lingered like a ghost over every word spoken. Jurors stole glances at her, recalling the sight of her tiny hand resting on Max's head, the sound of her voice cutting through the courtroom. Even as new evidence was presented, their minds drifted back to the moment that had moved them to tears. Hayes tried desperately to claw back control. His cross-examinations grew sharper, his tone more biting. But the harder he fought, the more brittle he appeared. The jury no longer saw a confident defender of justice. They saw a man scrambling against the tide of truth. Emily remained calm, deliberate, her voice steady. She didn't need theatrics. The moment had already been delivered, not by her, but by a child too young to understand the impact of her own words. All Emily needed to do was remind the jury of what their hearts already knew. As the day drew to a close, Judge Pierce recessed the court once more. Spectators filed out, buzzing with conversation. The victim's family hugged one another tightly, their eyes glistening with hope for the first time in months. And Max Loyal, steady Max, walked calmly beside his handler, but not before casting one last glance toward the child. His gaze was protective, almost fatherly, as if he understood his role in the truth that was unfolding. The impact of those two words continued to ripple far beyond the courthouse walls. By evening, television anchors spoke in hushed tones about the day's proceedings. Social media overflowed with clips, commentary, and outpourings of emotion. People across the nation found themselves captivated by a story that was no longer just about a trial. It was about innocence, loyalty, and the power of a bond too pure to deny. And though the trial was not yet over, everyone who had been present that day knew the truth. The child and the dog had already rewritten the story. The verdict, when it came, would only be a formality, because in that courtroom, justice had already spoken through the voice of a child and the wag of a tail. By the following morning, the courthouse no longer felt like the sterile chamber it had been at the start of the trial. The air was heavy with expectation, almost electric, as though everyone sensed the trial was no longer about arguments or evidence alone. The child's two words still echoed in the minds of the jury, and the sight of Max nuzzling against her knees replayed like a loop in every conversation. The defense knew it. The prosecution knew it. And Judge Pierce, sitting high on the bench, felt it in the marrow of his bones. When court resumed, Prosecutor Emily Grant walked to the center of the floor with a calm, almost reverent energy. She didn't raise her voice or storm around dramatically, as some lawyers did when trying to capture the jury's attention. She didn't need to. Her presence alone demanded it. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, turning slowly to face the jury. "Yesterday, you witnessed something that no transcript, no police report, no expert testimony could ever fully capture. You saw truth." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. A 3-year-old child, too young to fabricate lies or manipulate emotions, recognized Max, the very canine who was present the night of the crime. And Max, trained to be disciplined, calm and unemotional, broke that training because he too recognized her. That wasn't random. That wasn't chance. That was memory. That was trust. That was reality. The jurors sat riveted. Some nodded. A few clutched pens without writing. They didn't need notes. They were absorbing every word. Defense attorney Martin Hayes shot up, objecting loudly. "Your Honor, the prosecution is appealing to emotion, not law. We cannot base a verdict on the wag of a tail." Judge Pierce regarded him coolly. "Objection noted. The jury will consider the prosecution's remarks within the context of the evidence presented. Proceed, Miss Grant." Emily turned back to the jury, unfazed. "The defense would like you to dismiss. What you saw is meaningless. But you're human beings. You felt what happened in this room. And your instincts aren't wrong." She gestured toward the evidence photos displayed on the screen: footprints, fibers, and time-stamped surveillance stills. "Let's connect the dots." Max followed the trail that night. His training led him to the defendant. That's fact. But what you saw yesterday was not training. It was recognition. Recognition that places the child at the scene, and recognition that confirms what the physical evidence already tells us. The jury leaned forward. Her strategy was clear. Anchor their emotional response to the hard evidence, knitting both together so tightly that Hayes couldn't possibly untangle them. When it was Hayes's turn, he tried. He paced back and forth, his tone sharp, his gestures exaggerated. "We're talking about a child barely out of diapers. Children misremember things all the time. Dogs wag their tails for strangers. Are we really going to let our justice system be dictated by a toddler and a German shepherd?" But his words rang hollow. The more he spoke, the more defensive he sounded, as though he were fighting against a tide of inevitability. The jury's faces were closed, skeptical. They no longer saw him as a voice of reason. They saw him as a desperate man scrambling to preserve a crumbling defense. Hayes knew it too. Sweat dampened his collar as he launched into another attack, but even he seemed to lose conviction. Halfway through his argument, his voice trailed, his hands stilled, and for the first time in his career, he realized he had already lost. Across the aisle, Emily remained composed. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply let silence fall when Hayes sat down, as though to say, "You heard him. You know the truth." The next witness was called, a forensic expert who reviewed the timeline of evidence collection. Under Emily's questioning, the expert tied Max's tracking work to the defendant's belongings, reinforcing the credibility of the K-9's actions. But it was different now. Days earlier, the jury would have viewed the testimony as technical, dry, perhaps even confusing. Today, it was undeniable. The scientific data served as a backbone to the emotional truth they had already accepted. Even Judge Pierce, ever conscious of appearances, could feel the shift. The jurors weren't leaning back, passively listening. They were perched forward, engaged, eager to fit every piece of testimony into the puzzle that the child and the dog had revealed. By midday, the prosecution rested its case. The courtroom buzzed with a restrained energy. Everyone knew they had just witnessed the scales tip, not gradually, but decisively. During the recess, Spectators crowded the hallways, their voices spilling over one another in disbelief. Did you hear how she tied it all together? The dog, the evidence, the recognition. The defense doesn't stand a chance, another whispered. You could see it on the jurors' faces. They're done. Reporters filed stories at lightning speed, headlines flooding news sites and social media. Toddler and canine moment reshaped trial. One read. From tears to truth. The day the jury's minds changed, another declared. In the jury room, discussions mirrored the public reaction. A middle-aged woman dabbed her eyes as she spoke. I just keep hearing her voice. Good boy. It wasn't just words. She trusted him. That means something. A younger juror leaned forward, and it lines up with the evidence. The dog tracked the scene, brought the officers straight to him. Now we know why the child remembered him, because they were both there. It all fits. Not a single juror disagreed. The skepticism that had lingered in earlier deliberations had vanished. The child's innocence had melted away doubts like ice under the sun. Inside his chambers, Judge Pierce rubbed his temples. He had cautioned the jury to weigh facts over feelings, yet he couldn't ignore the undeniable truth. The moment they had all witnessed had become a turning point. Even he, the seasoned judge who prided himself on impartiality, felt its pull. By late afternoon, the defense called its final witness, a character reference for the defendant. But the testimony fell flat. The jury's faces were blank, there. Pens idle. Nothing could compete with what they had already seen. When court adjourned for the evening, the gallery buzzed with a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. Everyone knew the trial was heading toward its conclusion, but it no longer felt like a question of if. It felt like a question of when. The little girl and her mother slipped quietly out of the courtroom, escorted by officers. Max, once again at his handler's side, paused at the door and looked back one last time, his eyes locking with the jurors. Some swore later that it felt like he was silently reminding them of their duty, not just to the law, but to the truth. As the doors swung shut, the case had already turned. What had begun as a battle of evidence versus doubt had transformed into something much greater, a testament to innocence, loyalty, and the power of two simple words. And though the verdict had not yet been read, everyone, jury, judge, and spectator alike, knew where the trial was heading. The scales of justice had shifted, and they would not tip back. The jury filed back into the packed courtroom after hours of deliberation. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that seemed to settle deep into everyone's chest, making it hard to breathe. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between the door where the jurors had entered and the small figure of the child seated beside her mother. Reporters clutched their notepads and cameras, ready to capture history in the making. Even the judge, who had remained stoic throughout the long proceedings, looked restless, his fingers drumming quietly on the bench as he waited. The foreman of the jury rose to his feet, holding a slip of paper. The room went silent, so silent that one could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. The judge cleared his throat and asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman's voice trembled slightly, though it carried with authority. We have, Your Honor. He handed the folded paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge unfolded the verdict slowly, his eyes scanning the words before he spoke. On the charge of aggravated assault. The judge paused, lifting his gaze toward the defendant seated stiffly at the defense table. We find the defendant guilty. Gasps filled the room. The defendant clenched his fists, his face flushing with anger, while his attorney sank into his chair, shoulders slumped. The judge continued, reading each count with the same deliberate cadence. Guilty, guilty, guilty. With every word, The tension in the room transformed. Fear gave way to relief. Sorrow shifted toward justice, and the weight of weeks of testimony and evidence finally began to lift. The mother of the little girl covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She pulled her daughter into her arms, whispering softly, "It's over, sweetheart. It's finally over." The toddler looked around, confused by the wave of emotions crashing over the adults, but she smiled when her eyes found Max, the police canine, still sitting loyally near his handler. Max's ears perked up, his gaze fixed on the child, as though he, too, understood what had just happened. When the judge announced sentencing would be delivered at a later date, the courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed toward the doors, eager to be the first to break the story. Some jurors wept openly, overwhelmed by the gravity of their decision. Others sat still, their expressions etched with exhaustion, but also resolve. The defense attempted to salvage dignity, muttering about appeals, but their words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd outside the courthouse. For once, the system had worked exactly as it should, and people could feel it in their bones. The judge looked toward the little girl before dismissing the court. His stern demeanor softened, and his voice carried a rare warmth. "Sometimes," he said, "truth comes from the most unexpected places. Today, we were reminded of that." His words lingered in the air long after he rose from the bench and disappeared into his chambers. Outside the courthouse, the scene was unlike anything the city had seen in years. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved toward anyone connected to the case. Yet, amid the chaos, one image captured the hearts of millions. The little girl, dressed in a simple pink dress, reached out her tiny hand toward Max. The police dog, shedding his stoic demeanor, wagged his tail and pressed his head against her palm. The crowd fell silent for a moment, moved by the innocence of the gesture. Then, almost in unison, applause erupted, echoing down the courthouse steps. The moment spread like wildfire across social media. Photos and videos of the child with Max dominated news feeds within hours. Headlines blared, "Toddler and police canine deliver justice in courtroom," and two words that changed everything. People across the nation shared the story, their comments filled with tears, pride, and gratitude. For once, amid a world often divided, there was unity. Everyone agreed something extraordinary had unfolded in that courtroom, and it was worth remembering. Back at the police station, officers gathered around to watch the coverage on television. Hardened men and women who had seen the worst of us. Humanity wiped at their eyes, unashamed. Max was brought in, his handler giving him extra pats and praise. "You did good, buddy," the handler whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did real good." Treats were brought out, and Max basked in the attention, though his eyes seemed to search for the little girl he had bonded with so deeply. Meanwhile, the mother of the child received dozens of calls from strangers' offers of support, words of encouragement, and messages of admiration. She remained humble, insisting she was just a mother protecting her daughter. But deep down she knew this story had touched something bigger than them all. Her daughter's innocent words had cut through lies, manipulation, and fear, revealing a truth that no one could deny. In the weeks that followed, the story didn't fade. Documentaries were pitched, news specials aired, and schools across the country discussed the trial as a lesson in courage, truth, and the power of innocence. The little girl's picture with Max became an iconic image framed on walls, shared in classrooms, and pinned to police station boards as a reminder of why justice mattered. But for the child herself, life returned to normal in small but meaningful ways. She played in the yard, clutched her stuffed animals at night, and giggled at cartoons. To her, Max wasn't a hero dog or a courtroom witness. He was simply the Good boy, she had remembered. Her words, spoken without agenda, had unknowingly shifted the course of justice. The judge's remarks echoed long after the trial ended. Truth sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. And perhaps, in this case, it came from a bond between a toddler and a dog, pure, untainted, and undeniable. Months later, during a small community event honoring local heroes, the little girl and Max were reunited once more. The crowd watched in awe as Max bounded forward, his tail wagging furiously, and the girl squealed with delight. She wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, whispering the same two words that had captured the world, "Good boy." Tears streamed down the faces of everyone present. It was a reminder that sometimes justice isn't found in lengthy testimonies or complex legal arguments, but in the simple, honest truth spoken from a child's heart. The world would never forget that day in the courtroom. It wasn't just a trial that had been won. It was hope restored, faith renewed, and a reminder that innocence still had the power to change everything.